Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to have a look at the suggestions past the developers for June of 2024. This time we're having a look at the ground stuff, and there is quite a lot of it, so let's get into it. The first vehicle is for Germany, and it is the Spähpanzer 2 Luchs A2. This vehicle is pretty similar to the Type 87 RCV. The idea of it is that it was a German light tank or scout which was developed in the Cold War around the 60s to the 70s to replace the Bulldog and of course the Spähpanzer SP-11 Kurz. It was produced between 1975 and 77 with a total of 408 of them being built and used by the West German Army. The vehicle was used from 1975 till 2009 when it was retired. This vehicle is an 8-wheeled one with a small turret with access to a 20mm, the Rheinmetall 202. It could fire DM-43, and also the armor of it was bulletproof to 7.62mm rounds. It had different engines depending on which variant you look at. There was the Daimler-Benz OM403VA Flex Fuel V10 engine with 390 horsepower for diesel and 300 horsepower for petrol. So if you could actually feed it with different fuels and it would give you different outputs, which is something that I don't know if we've seen in the game before, which is quite fun. It also had a pretty powerful transmission, meaning that it had 4 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, and also access to a stabilizer, grenade launchers, and also a thermal imager for the gunner. For the Soviets, we have the Object 770, which is another heavy tank project from the 50s and 60s that didn't really go anywhere. An order was sent out to develop a new heavy tank in 1955, with requirements to come in 1956. The new heavy tank produced by these requirements would have served as the T-10's successor. These requirements also led to the development of the Object 277, 278, and 279, developed by LKZ and VN2-100. Object 770 was the project created by CHKZ's Design Bureau, SKB2, whom had previously designed the IS-3, the 4, and also the T-10. They had also just in the years prior designed the Object 752 and the 777, neither of which got to prototype stage. These were also intended as successors to the T-10, but it's unclear why these were canned, but they served as references when creating both the T-10M and also the Object 770. There were 2 prototypes of the 770 created, one in 59 and the other one in 60. The engine suffered from major vibrational issues, which caused delays in its development. In trials, even though their characteristics were very similar, it clearly outperformed the Object 277, and thus the 277 and the 8 were cancelled on the 19th of July 1960. Multiple sources say Khrushchev himself stopped the development of all tanks above 37 tons during a demonstration on the 22nd of July 1960. But it's unclear if this is true or not. There are ideas that he likely remarked that his distaste for such heavy vehicles at the demonstration, and therefore he'd kind of continued with his ideas that he'd said previously. But the development of both the 279 and 770 seemed to continue, though their future was obviously bleak. The 279 was cancelled in January of 1961, while the 770 made it to mid-February 1961, making the Object 770 the last surviving Soviet heavy tank project of the USSR, and probably the last in the world, as by this time every other major nation had also given up on heavy tanks. This vehicle had access to the 130mm M65 gun, it had a 2-plane stabilizer, and also a 14.5mm KPVT coaxial gun, which is quite fun. It had a 1000 horsepower engine and a top speed of 55 kilometers an hour. For the Japanese, we have the STC-1 MBT prototype. This is basically the prototype of the Type 90, but the STC name was actually the one used by the Japanese media, basically following on from the STA series and the STB. But the Type 90 prototype was not actually called, or the program itself was not called STC, it was actually called NTK, which is kind of interesting, which is why the individual tanks themselves are known as TKX000, and then so on. So basically, in this one, we're talking about the Type 90 prototype, which is at least colloquially known from the media side as the STC-1. The Mitsubishi company was tasked by the SDF to develop a new MBT for Japan to replace the aging Type 74s. A task that will give way to multitudes of tank prototypes and also testbeds. The Tank X program, which is what it was called, went through a series of different designs for their main battle tank candidates, the most iconic of which is the STC-1, which was one of Japan's first new MBT prototypes, relying on a more sloped turret design and a Japanese-made Steelworks 120mm and 135mm smoothbore cannon. The STC-1 prototype relied less on the modular composite and more on having thicker RHA plating. However, once Japan mastered the techniques of composite, which made progress in the early 90s, Japan later on decided to rely on more modular composite placements seen on the modern Type 90 MBT. The STC-1 was also the first prototype of what would later become the Type 90 that we all know. The STC-1 was Japan's first attempt in developing a new modern MBT to replace the aging and outdated Type 74s. There were two versions, the 1 and the 2, that were fitted with a made-in-Japan cannon, the 135mm gun by Daikin Industries. After some intensive tests, they changed the cannon to the 120mm L44, which was built by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, but the SDF wanted to reduce the manufacturing cost of this new MBT, so Mitsubishi instead opted for making a contract with Rheinmetall to produce their own licensed version of the L44, which was mounted on the two later prototypes, which was the STC-3 and also the STC-4. The key difference between the STC-1 and the Type 90 that you know is this. The design of the hull of the tank was very similar to that of the Abrams tank, and both have the driver positioned at the center. However, the upper front plate of the STC-1 was sloped even more than that of the Abrams tank. There's also two headlights, which are in a different place. The turret design of the STC followed a similar design philosophy to the sloped Type 74's turret design, with much of the protection being offered by an 85-degree sloping of the turret roof, which was designed to deflect shells. In addition, the armor protection found on the STC-1 would be very similar to that of the Type 90 that we have at the front of the Space Steel side turret armor, but the biggest drawback was the absolutely massive mantlet, which was designed to also accommodate a 135mm gun. Though the 135 was fired and tested, it was never mounted on the STC-1. They only mounted the homemade 120mm smoothbore gun made by Japan Steelworks on the prototype. Also, Daikin Industries was tasked with working on making a new APF-SDS shell. This was used at, it had extremely high hardness tungsten composite alloy with a hardness scale of 39 on the Rockwell scale and an elongation at break 12.4%, which is pretty fun. Basically, they designed this gun and then they just never used it. So this one would be kind of interesting. Seems like a fun vehicle. For China, we have the BW-120K. Originally created as a licensed T-54A copy, the Type 59 saw a long life within the People's Liberation Army. During its service life, the Type 59 saw massive success both in China and also abroad. In the 70s, the Type 59 began to have a lot of upgrades to improve its capabilities and extend its service life. Technology from the West began to come in due to a warming in relations, and the first major upgrade using this technology was the Type 59-2. The Type 59-2 was first adopted in 1984 and used a lot of new technology that had never seen service in the PLA, including the 105mm L7 derived gun, a British Marconi fire control system, modern APF-SDS-T ammunition, and also much more. But even with the Type 59-2 and subsequent variants, Norinco wanted to take the Type 59 design further. Beginning in the 1990s, Norinco created a modified Type 59-2 using a 120mm smoothbore gun, primarily as a testbed. The reasoning for this testbed seems to be debated, with most sources claiming it was for export, but some claiming it was to test the feasibility of a larger gun on the Type 59 chassis. Beforehand, the idea of using a 125mm gun had been proposed, but on first and second generation tanks, like the Type 59, the autoloader would not fit in the tank, and the breech itself would make the turret too cramped. As such, Norinco settled for a 120mm gun, a caliber already in service with the PTZ-89. The PTZ-89. However, there is some debate still over the gun's origin. When revealed at a Norinco weapons exhibition in 1997, the gun used a thermal sleeve and had a chrome-lined barrel to extend barrel life, but since the vehicle was likely intended for export, inside not much was changed. In spite of this, auxiliary systems such as the radio set, generator for the engine, and also the interior layout were changed. The fire control system became more sophisticated. Including a day-night sight, the vehicle also introduced two-plane stabilization, a periscope for the commander, and possibly a laser rangefinder. The APF-STS round developed by Norinco uses a semi-combustible cartridge case, with the weight of the shell, including the sabot, being 7.33 kilos, and the weight of the core being 4.1. The muzzle velocity is reported to be at about 1660 meters per second, and the penetration at 1500 being 550 millimeters. The turret could rotate 360 degrees, and the barrel has elevation angles of -5 to 18 degrees. However, as with many tank projects, this ambitious Type 59 variant was not adopted by the People's Liberation Army or any other nation. The fate of the vehicle or vehicles is unknown, but it would not be the end of the Type 59, as a number of countries and China itself managed to later outfit the Type 59 with a 125mm gun, such as the Type 59G and also the De Joy. For France, we have the ELC Even 120. The vehicles under the name ELC are part of a prototype project for light tanks launched by the French Ministry of Defense. This project was to develop a lightly armored, heavily armed fighting vehicle that had the capability of being airlifted for quick deployment. Throughout the 40s and 50s, the French military studied several concepts of light tank destroyers. Their objective was to produce a vehicle with the intent of being able to destroy the Soviet IS-3 or the IS-4 heavy tanks through the use of sufficient firepower, whilst also being cheap, simple to construct, and also mobile. Many early proposals were submitted by the famous Hotchkiss, Renault, and an engineer from a small company, Établissement Brunon-Valais, by the name of Even. The problem with these early proposals was that most were armed with recoilless rifles. These gained popularity due to their non-existent recoil, lightweight, and also immense firepower, allowing for light vehicles to be as dangerous as some of their heavier counterparts that sported the same caliber. Despite this, the guns lacked accuracy beyond short range, and also low muzzle velocity, which also resulted in short range. This contributed to the downfall of vehicles such as the T-114. The result of this was that in 1955, the French military realized that such weapons would not be effective in the landscape of the Eastern Europe area, which consisted of plains and open fields in which the hypothetical conflict with the Eastern Bloc would have taken place. Therefore, it was requested that vehicles built to fulfill the 1953 requirements should be redesigned with non-recoilless weapons, and the project was renamed to Engin Léger de Combat, or Light Combat Vehicle, or ELC for short. Evans created one prototype and one mock-up under the old requirements that did not disallow the use of recoilless rifles. The mock-up was made in 1953 and was armed with 4 Brandt 120mm recoilless rifles housed in a turret able to rotate 360 degrees. The shells fired by the Brandt 120 had around 300mm of penetration, which was 50mm better than the minimum of 250 that was being asked for. The ELC Even 90 could perform a full turret rotation in 15 seconds, resulting in a 24 degrees per second turret rotation speed. This can be applied to the ELC Even 120, as unfortunately the information doesn't seem to be around. The elevation and depression angles were -9 to +13, which was quite fun, and also it did have some armor on it, but not a ton. Mainly its armor was its low silhouette, therefore it wouldn't be seen. The problem that they even faced, though, was reloading the actual full recoilless rifles. The breech of the rifles were attached to the turret and could not be reloaded from within the vehicle like a conventional gun could be, or even the T-114. There were two ways of reloading these guns, both having to be performed by the driver. One way to reload the guns was to have the gunner position the turret, which allowed the driver to shove 120mm rocket shells into the breeches while still lying down. This made it hard and slow to do, but kept the driver protected. The second way was for the driver to exit the vehicle and manually load the rocket shells from the outside. A third option was proposed, and that was to make the guns break open 90 degrees like a break-action rifle, and therefore the gunner could reload these. This opens the opportunity for a very unique reload animation, but I don't think ever actually happened. Due to the change of the requirements in 1956 and the poor firing and mobility trials that took place in 1956, they even went back to the drawing board and made corrections to avoid failures and poor results of the prototype. Even came up with the two new versions, both being tested in November of 57. These two versions were the ELC Even 90 and the ELC Even 30. Then we have a Frankenstein, the MOWAG BOFORS, which is a Shark 8x8 Trinity 40mm SPAA. So, a very interesting machine. In the early 80s, after seeing the devastating effect of anti-ship missiles in the Falklands War, BOFORS saw a potential gap in the market that modern SAM systems couldn't fill, and can breathe some new life into the old 40mm anti-air gun with some modernizations of their unsuccessful BOFORS system, a previous venture by the company in the 70s to develop a combined FCS platform, BOFORS being Bofors Optronic Fire Control Instrument. The Trinity was in a sense a modernization of the 1970s BOFORS system, but would be even more modern and capable with better computational power, target engagement protocols, and also modularity in a self-contained proposed built turret system. To do this, the project identified three key elements to modernize and synergize: the 40mm Bofors gun, a modern FCS, and also their new 3PHV proxy-fused ammunition. This in order to combat low-flying aircraft, helicopters, and missiles as an effective close-in air defense system with quick engagement time. The latter, missiles, was more precisely the anti-ship missile mentioned in the beginning, so the idea was this could go after those. When it came to the delivery method, the 40mm projectile was an obvious choice. From the beginning of the gun's development in the 1930s, it was designed as a high-velocity anti-air projectile with a high payload capacity that guaranteed great damage with a single hit while still remaining relatively small. This remained true even when it was upgraded later on with a bulkier proximity fuse, which sacrificed some internal space. It could still carry enough explosive to remain as lethal thanks to the perfections of the design made during its long lifespan. With a proven gun and updated projectile, the final piece was a fire control system to guide the gun and program the ammunition. Most of the work of the FCS was done with a purpose-built homebrewed microprocessor. This microprocessor allowed the system to detect, calculate, and engage a target in about 2 seconds. While already great for AA use, the gun could also be used for anti-armor purposes, which has not been lost on the manufacturer. With several armor-piercing projectiles being developed for the gun, these rounds will not be discussed since they aren't very useful. With the project in full swing, the first unveiling of the Trinity system occurred during the 1984 Farnborough Air Show, with some cryptic advertising preceding it. A year or so later, in 1985, the assembling and first hardware test took place, with further qualification testing during 86 and 87. 88 saw the first sea trials of the naval variant, when 2 naval turrets were completed and tested on the Royal Swedish Navy's land sword minesweeper, the Vinga. More importantly, this year also saw the first functioning land platform turret, the Armored Trinity. The Armored Trinity was tested extensively on the MOWAG Shark 8x8, which is what we're looking at right now. Although the sensors were intended to be installed in an enclosed turret, they were for the entirety of the test mounted in an open installation for simplicity. One photo shows what the intended turret system would be, or at least would look like when it was fully housed. So even though on the setup you don't see the turret on top of it, that's what it should look like. The MOWAG Shark itself was another private venture by the Swiss firm MOWAG, launched in the very early 80s. The Shark 8x8 was following the success of the earlier product, the Piranha armored vehicle, which was a lighter APC in comparison and is still used to this day in upgraded forms. The Shark, however, would not see the same fame and success as its smaller brother, but not for lack of trying. While the Piranha occupied a spot in the APC market, the heavier Shark was intended to be more of a weapons carrier compatible for a wide assortment of systems and corner that market of the arms market. While a good idea, many nations who had purchased the Piranha didn't see the need to buy a similar vehicle, and often chose to modify or upgrade existing systems and lighter APCs, like the aforementioned Piranha, to roles that the Shark 8x8 was meant to fill. In some ways, MOWAG was itself its biggest competitor. The vehicle featured, among other improvements compared to the Piranha, increased protection, it was resistance against 14.5mm AP, a better power plant, 530 compared to 275 horsepower, and also better ground pressure, and the main selling point, a well-balanced centrally located turret position that placed the center of gravity in the middle of the whole vehicle. This design made it very stable and easy to install a whole suite of available systems that a potential customer may want, making tailor-made versions to easily create and easy to provide. In order to attract customers and show off its armament versatility, MOWAG demonstrated a wide array of systems able to be installed on the chassis. The first one was in 1981 at the Paris Air Show, armed with an Oerlikon Burl Type GGD BOE two-man turret, armed with a 35mm cannon and coaxial 7.62mm machine gun. Other systems included the FL-12 turret, armed with a 105mm gun, experimental Rheinmetall turrets with a 105mm Rheinmetall 105-11 low recoil gun, and also the Wildcat Twin 30mm SPA system, the Crowtail SAM system, the ADATs, which obviously we already have, and lastly, the BOFORS Trinity, first tested around 1985. For Israel, we have the Bardam Snai, or the Saga. This is a Soviet-made missile carrier, the 9P-122, which was used by Egypt and Syria in 1973 Yom Kippur War, which were captured by Israel throughout the war and remained in active service with the IDF until the late 80s. A considerable amount of 9P-122s and a missile stock for them remained in the reserve with the IDF after the war. Bardam units, armed with Snai missiles, took part in the First Lebanese War, but never saw any real combat. The chassis of the vehicle is the Bardam. The BRDM-2 received a nickname the Bardam in Israeli, and the ATGM, the 9M14M Malyutka, received the IDF, in the IDF, a Snai nickname, but no one seems to use it. These missiles almost exclusively were called Saga by the US and the NATO designation, which of course is the AT-3 Saga. For Thailand, we have the Commando Stingray. The Stingray was developed privately by Cadillac Gage Textron in the 1980s as a new lightweight airborne vehicle for export, with the first prototype completed in 1984. In 1992, the development of the Stingray 2 began. To be competitive on the market, the Stingray was less technologically advanced than the HS-TVL, but relied on existing components from other US armored vehicles to keep costs down. The emphasis was of course on mobility and armament, to the detriment of the armor in a classic light tank cavalry pattern. Production was completed in 1994, and marketing continued to countries such as Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and Taiwan until 2003. In 1988, the RTA brought the Stingray into service with a purchase of 106 tanks. The contract was worth $150 million. Cadillac Gage assisted in repairing some tanks after reports of cracked hulls were received. The Stingray turret was also marketed separately, since it could be fitted on the hull of the M41, 47, M551, and also the V600 APC. Further marketing efforts were unsuccessful, and Thailand remains the only user of the Stingray to this day. The Stingray was designed to increase strategic and tactical mobility and serve as an air transportable light tank so it can be transported by a C-130 Hercules or similar cargo aircraft. The tank is armed with a fully stabilized 105mm low recoil force smoothbore cannon derived from the British L7A3. This cannon is equivalent in performance to that used in the M1 Abrams main battle tank. It can fire the entire spectrum of NATO ammunition. That includes M426 and M735A1 APF SDS rounds. It carries 32 rounds of 105mm ammunition, of which most are stored below the turret ring, and 8 rounds in the turret. The 3 ready-to-use cartridges are stored in special individual holders configured for all types of 105mm ammunition. A coaxial 7.62mm machine gun and a 12.7mm machine gun mounted on the roof of the secondary armament. The gunner has an Optic Electronic Corporation M36E1 roof-mounted day-night sight. Optionally, this can be replaced with an M36E1 Sire day-night sight with a laser rangefinder or a thermal imaging system. The Commander has an NV52 day-night sight, 7 periscopes and a one-piece hatch. Originally powered was a stock Detroit diesel Allison AV92A or TA 535 horsepower engine, but the production model for the Royal Thai Army was a liquid-cooled supercharged 2-stroke V8 diesel engine producing 550 horsepower, which is quite fast. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank GMG Smiley, CD Beans, Chieftain Mike, EMN3 Galaxy, Tulio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Ozzy Panzer, Alan Hacker, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Sem Aslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.